So it turns out that the founding fathers were much smarter than you think they were. I'm talking to you with a liberal arts degree who just says they were slave owners. They actually came up with the most impressive system of government maybe ever. It's not their fault we didn't listen to them. And that's really the funny part and kind of the sad part is they warned us about all the things that could cause this American system of government to fail, and we didn't listen to them. So I'm going to go through the 9 most important warnings that the founding fathers gave us that we didn't listen to. And then we'll compare it to modern day, and you'll see that all these things that they warned us about came to pass. Very depressing. So we'll start with the first warning. Probably the most well-known warning is about political factions or political parties. So they warned us saying political parties would divide the country, turn Americans against each other, corrupt public judgment, and become tools for ambitious men. That's the summary of it, and we'll dive in deeper. Washington made this one of the central warnings of his 1796 farewell address. He warned that party spirit could distract the public councils, agitate the community, produce false alarms, and open the door to foreign influence and corruption. He also warned that parties could become potent engines used by cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men to rise to power. Madison made a similar argument in Federalist number 10, where he described factions as groups driven by passions or interests, opposed to the rights of others or the common good. So George Washington dedicated a large part of his farewell address to the dangers of political parties and partisan loyalties, essentially stating that factions would lead to division, corruption, and eventually despotism. And the definition of despotism is a form of government or political system where a single ruler or small group holds absolute unchecked power. Sound familiar? And so the constitutional framers intentionally omitted political parties from the founding documents in an attempt to prevent the adversarial gridlock they observed in British politics. And obviously, we now live in a two-party system. It's Democrat-Republican. We clearly did not listen to that warning. And the very frustrating part is people think that it's, oh, Democrats versus Republicans. But no, it's them versus us. You have to realize that they're on the same team. The Democrats say they're fighting the Republicans. The Republicans say they're fighting the Democrats. But they're at the same parties together, they're at galas together, while we, the sheep, the people, suffer and think, well, if I just vote Republican in this election, if I just vote Democrat in this election, maybe something will change. Idiot. Hopefully by now you understand that that's not the case. So we're going to move on to the second warning. The second warning was against foreign entanglements. Their warning was that America should avoid permanent alliances and becoming trapped in foreign conflicts. Again, sound familiar. All of it's going to sound familiar. In Washington's same farewell address, he also talks about steering clear of permanent alliances. He feared that emotional attachment or hatred toward foreign nations would distort American judgment and drag the country into conflicts that did not serve its own interest. Having just won independence from the British Empire, the founders strongly feared foreign manipulation, deep-pocketed interests, and becoming pawns in European power struggles. So there were safeguards such as the Foreign Emoluments Clause that were built into the Constitution to block federal officials from receiving gifts or titles from foreign states without congressional approval. The obvious parallel here is that today, the US finds itself in every foreign conflict, right? We're at war with Iran. I think we're still at war with Iran, and we're kind of pseudo-involved in every foreign conflict, and we have been for a long time now. And while Washington felt that this threat came from European powers, where we've experienced it is from powers in the Middle East, in particular Israel. I think you could argue that the only reason the US is at war with Iran is largely due to Israel. That's not the topic of this video, but it's clear that it is in Israel's interest to bomb and attack Iran. It's not so clear how that is America's interest. And again, another issue that should have been put in here is dual citizenship, dual loyalty. You should not be in a congressional position if you have dual loyalty or dual citizenship. So we'll move on to the third warning, which is the concentration of power. The warning is that power concentrated in one national government, one branch, or one ruler would eventually threaten liberty. This one needs a little nuance, But the Articles of Confederation did originally create a much looser union, where Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. That proves the first American system was highly state-centered. But the Constitution was later written because the Articles were too weak to function effectively. So it's important to note that the founding generation deeply valued state sovereignty and limited federal power. In Madison's Federalist number 51, he explains the solution: divide power so that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Pretty smart. Obviously, coming from the British Empire, one of the main fears the founders had was that an eventual tyrant would arise. So they instituted a strict system of checks and balances across the three co-equal branches, initially planned to set up US as a confederation where the states maintained full sovereignty, but it was too difficult to levy armies, tax states, enforce laws, or regulate trade. But the spirit of the founding was initially to be more of a confederation, and I think that's very important. The obvious contrast when you look at modern politics is that the federal government has more power than it ever has in US history. It spends trillions annually, and it's involved in areas that the founding generation could never have fathomed. So this didn't happen overnight. There were a few key points in history that happened. One would be the Civil War. I know everybody thinks that the Civil War is only about slavery. Slavery was the law in question. It was about state sovereignty versus centralized Federalist power. When the North won, it was a declaration that federal power, federal authority trumps state authority. And that's important because it did reframe the initial spirit of the founding. I think the second thing that happened was a consolidation of wealth that started in the Industrial Revolution, where a few small families gathered monopolies and gathered billions of dollars. And that's why now there is kind of this oligarchy amongst billionaires. And then third, maybe the most impactful one in recent history was Bush Cheney, when Dick Cheney pushed for the unitary executive theory, which we're not going to go into detail on that, but essentially it's the theory that the executive branch, the president, has more power than initially thought. So where does that leave us now? Well, now the president just writes endless executive orders. So again, this is not what the founding fathers wanted. Moving on to number 4, they warned us against mob rule and emotional democracy. Their fear was both unchecked democracy and unchecked aristocracy, and it's a difficult balance to find. Their warning was a republic can collapse when public opinion is driven by passion, manipulation, ignorance, or temporary outrage. Madison's Federalist number 10 is the key source here. He argued that a pure democracy offers no cure for faction and can become unstable when majority passions overpower rights and reason. In Federalist number 63, Madison also warned that the people may be stimulated by some irregular passion or misled by artful misrepresentations, causing them to demand policies they later regret. Washington added in the farewell address that public opinion must be enlightened because the more a government depends on public opinion, the more essential education becomes. So the founding fathers feared two things: mob rule from democracy and oligarchy from aristocracy. And in this weird turn of events, we have both currently. The founding fathers favored a structured Republican government that balanced public participation with mechanisms to carefully deliberate and temper raw popular power. That's why an election isn't just based off of a popular vote. So obviously what happened since then is that America has expanded suffrage into a broad or mass democracy, including the 26th Amendment, where we lowered the voting age to 18. And I would argue that civic knowledge and political seriousness has greatly declined. So here's a note here. The founders knew that not everyone should be able to vote because it leads to mob rule, but they also warned against aristocracy where only the wealthy could vote. That becomes a very tricky balance because if too few people can vote, you're going to find yourself in an aristocracy. But if everyone can vote, even the dummies, you get what you have today. You have mob rule. The political climate is not tailored towards the educated or the intelligent. It's catered towards the dumbest among us. That's why if you have any brain at all, you turn on the news or you tune into a presidential debate, it's the dumbest thing you've ever heard. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's because all of this is tailored towards the average voter. And the average voter has an IQ of 100, which is really low. I'm not going to be mean, but it's really low. So the original idea was, for the most part, you had to be a landowner to vote, or you had to meet a certain tax requirement. The idea was that you had to have a certain stake in society to be able to vote. And so the overall situation was there were a lot less voters who had much less direct power. And that's a good thing. So I do not believe that everybody should vote. I'm more on board with a small percentage of people should vote. I think 10 to 20% of the US population should be able to vote, and they would only be able to vote for representatives, and that's it. And so who gets to be that 10 to 20%? Well, you should have to pass a US history and political literacy test, an emotional test to prove that you do not vote emotionally, and you have to be a net taxpayer in society, right? Not a net tax receiver. And this keeps in line with the original sentiment of the founding that the voter should have to have a stake in society to be able to vote. So we'll move on to number 5 now, which is they warned us against foreign influence in American politics. The warning is foreign powers would try to manipulate American leaders, elections, parties, and public opinion. Well, yeah. So Washington called foreign influence one of the most dangerous enemies of Republican government in his farewell address. Hamilton also warned in Federalist number 68 that foreign powers would love to raise a creature of their own to the presidency. This fear was built directly into the Constitution through the Foreign Emoluments Clause, which forbids federal office holders from accepting gifts, titles, offices, or payments from foreign states without congressional consent. We kind of went over this earlier. So the modern parallel is not just foreign wars, but it's foreign lobbying. I'm looking at you, AIPAC, and foreign money, foreign propaganda, global institutions, and politicians who seem more loyal to international opinion than to their own citizens. Again, there's some obvious examples here. One example is Thomas Massey, because this recently happened. In a rural Kentucky primary, AIPAC and MAGA spent $30 million to unseat this guy because he criticized AIPAC and Israel. I think this is obvious, but there should be no dual citizenship. There should be no dual loyalty in US politics. And there should be no foreign influence in media or news or social media. But the problem is foreign countries influence our politics through our social media algorithms and through our mainstream news sources, and by donating to our congressmen and women. That's a huge problem, and that's a video for another time. But that is absolutely happening. We have more foreign influence in our government than most people know. But we'll move on, and we're going to go through the rest of these a bit quicker. So number 6, they warned us against public debt. Debt should not be casually passed on to future generations. Washington addressed this directly in the farewell address, telling Americans to cherish public credit, but use it sparingly and avoid the accumulation of debt. His point was not that a nation should never borrow. He understood that wars and emergencies may require spending, but he warned against making debt a permanent habit and throwing the burden onto posterity. This is an obvious parallel to what we have now, where we have 40 trillion in national debt and no way to pay it off. I think that the current interest payment is the largest government expenditure that we have now, and that's so bad. How are we going to get rid of it? I think we're probably going to inflate the debt away, which means that you and me and everybody else gets fucked. We're moving on to number 7. They warned us that liberty requires virtue, morality, and religion. The warning was a free republic cannot survive if the people become morally corrupt. Washington's farewell address says that religion and morality are indispensable supports of political prosperity. His argument was that self-government requires self-control. If citizens lose virtue, discipline, moral seriousness, and reverence for something higher than appetite, then freedom becomes impossible because the people will either abuse liberty or beg for government control to manage the chaos. Obviously, people now abuse liberty. There is no sense of morality or love anymore in modern America or modern society in general. There is only ideology. I've made videos again about how evil is simply putting ideology above love or God, so I won't get too deep into this one, but essentially, what has happened in America is that the family unit, the idea of family and love, has been completely destroyed by a certain ideology. Again, I've talked about this in other videos. Moving on to number 8, they warned against executive overreach. The warning was that no single man should be trusted with too much power. Madison's Federalist number 51 explains that the Constitution's structure was designed to prevent the gradual concentration of power in the same hands. The solution was checks and balances. Congress, the president, and the courts would each have tools to resist the others. Hamilton also defended limits on executive power in foreign affairs. Right now, the executive branch really has full power of foreign affairs. It has very little power over domestic affairs, but has complete and unchecked power over foreign affairs. So that's a problem. In Federalist number 75, he argued that treaty making should not be left to the president alone, because an ambitious leader might use foreign power for his own advancement. I mean, do I really even have to explain that one? The modern parallel is the expansion of executive orders, emergency powers, agency rulemaking, undeclared wars, and presidents increasingly acting as if they are national managers rather than just the highest officer of the Constitution. So the obvious parallel people are going to draw is Trump, but this started way before Trump. It started with the unitary executive theory in the Bush and Cheney era, and it was also used by Obama and Biden. It's not a partisan thing anymore, even though it really started in the Bush era. But ever since then, the president has subscribed to the unitary executive theory, and that's not a good thing. Moving on to the last point is number 9. They warned us that the Constitution only works if the people are educated. The warning is that public opinion is dangerous when it is ignorant, emotional, or easily manipulated. That's like at least 80% of the voter base right there. Washington said in the farewell address that institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge should be a primary object because public opinion must be enlightened. The problem is our education system has been absolutely destroyed. I'm not going to get into that one because that's a topic maybe for another time, but it was destroyed. And now people are stupid and ignorant and vote emotionally. And people are easily manipulated by propaganda. People don't even understand that they're being propagandized. They get offended if you say that. And part of news is always going to be propaganda. So you have to have a brain on you to sift through the bullshit and figure out what is true, what is not true, and leave a little room for confusion. That's important. But there's just this partisan loyalty, this ideology that just completely destroys any reason. It makes people so emotional. People are so politically emotional. And it starts with our education system. I do believe that. There's other powers that be that do not have America's interest in mind, and they have destroyed America from the inside. So this video is long enough. I think I'll leave it there. But if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you.